All right, welcome everybody to the Ojai City Council and Planning Commission special joint meeting of July 8th, 2013. Roll call for the City Council, please.
Councilmember Clapp? Here. Councilmember Lara?
Here.
Councilmember Smith is absent. Mayor Pro Tem Strobel? Present. Mayor Black?
Here. And roll call for the Planning Commission, please.
Commissioner Becker?
Here.
Commissioner Crabtree?
Here.
Commissioner Foster?
Here.
Commissioner Nolan? Here. Commissioner Osborne?
Here.
Vice Chair Merck?
Here.
And Chair Nicklin.
Yeah.
And if I could ask Chair Nicklin to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, well, once again, thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to this workshop session. And the workshop has to do with our 2014 to 2021 housing element update. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our staff members and Mr. Clark. And I'd also hope that you're going to be introducing John Douglas to us.
We absolutely will. So first of all, I want to thank you all for being here. This is very exciting. We're kicking off a whole new housing element cycle after spending the past year on the last one. But I think it's a great opportunity to take a fresh look at all the policies. We do have John Douglas, our new housing consultant, here for the first time. And it's really the kickoff and the very beginning of what will be a long process where we do spend the time that we need to do to have a housing element that reflects Ojai values. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Rob Mullane, who in turn will introduce John, and John will give us a presentation.
Hey. Mr. Mullane.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, everyone. As Rob Clark mentioned, we have John Douglas here. John's got a tremendous amount of experience with housing element consulting work for other communities, including many communities in Southern California and in Ventura County. And as the council and commission may recall, John's proposal was very highly received, and I've worked with John on a couple other capacities, and I've been very impressed with him in action. I think he'll serve the community very well in this capacity. So I'm going to let John introduce himself in a little bit more detail and maybe talk about a few of the other communities where he's either worked in or is currently working in addition to Ojai.
Mr. Douglas, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor, council members, commissioners. It really is a pleasure and a privilege to be here working with a community like Ojai. I have a few slides to go through. I'll just give a very brief introduction of myself since none of you have met me before. I've had the pleasure of working with Rob in the city of Malibu a couple of years ago. I've been a planner for coming up on 40 years now, and about half of my career has been spent in the public sector working for cities and counties, and the other half has been in consulting. And I just happened to fall into this topic of housing elements about 30 years ago. And I suppose I've kind of lost count, but I think I've done maybe 75 of them at this point. I've had the pleasure of working with 6 other cities in Ventura County on their housing elements. The ones that I have not worked with are Fillmore, Oxnard, and Simi Valley. Worked with all the others. Every community is different. Every community is unique. Some are more unique than others. I had the chance to work with some unusual communities. Anybody ever heard of Hidden Hills in the western end of the San Fernando Valley? Many beach communities, Laguna Beach, Hermosa Beach, Manhattan Beach, Seal Beach, Malibu, and some inland smaller communities, Rolling Hills Estates. It's really a special pleasure for planners to work with communities who really care about their community. You know, lots of people work in communities and they go home at night and it's a house and it's a place to live, and they care about something from a land use standpoint if it's right next door to them. But in terms of really deeply caring about the community, that's not all that common. And so as a planner, I really enjoy, we do some work to put food on the table, and then we do some other work that it's really a labor of love. So I'm very much looking forward to this, and I'm very optimistic about the outcome. If any of you have any questions in general before I go over to the podium and start talking about housing elements, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Any questions for Mr. Douglas? John?
I have a question. Have you had a chance to review our current housing element? And I'm wondering what you think of it.
Yes, I have had a chance to review it, and I've also spent some time reviewing the ordinances and watching some of your previous meetings on the internet and so forth. I think it is a very solid document. It was certified by the state, which is no simple feat, as you know, some places more difficult than others. And I understand that there were mixed feelings among the community members about it. I mean, yes, it accomplished the goal of complying with state law, but there were also some issues that were hard to swallow. And so I think that's one of the things that we have on our plate this time, is to revisit a few things, see if we can make it better, make it fit the community better. Housing elements are a special challenge because they're always this push and shove between complying with what the state requires and at the same time having policies and programs that suit your community. And so sometimes you have to thread the needle, and the state doesn't get everything that it wants and the community doesn't get everything that it wants, but you thread that needle and you get the state's blessing and avoid lawsuits, and you get hopefully most of what the community wants to see in terms of their land use.
Any other questions of Mr. Douglas? We're ready for your presentation.
All right, I will. I'm not going to give you the Housing Element 101 talk because you've already been through that for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm going to give you the 306 talk or something like that.
And Rhonda will have the remote control for you, John.
Oh.
Well, come on, there. That way you can view it here and there. This, I have that one.
Those of you that are on that side, I apologize. Oh, you can see that, or you can turn around and see that.
Up and down are the ways to enhance the
Just be able to point it at the screen, not the machine. What is that?
I hear it beeping, but I don't see it changing. Up and down. Oh. I was pushing up and I had to push down. Okay, just a quick terminology here. I think you've all heard the term fourth cycle. That's the housing element that was just adopted last year. And then the implementation programs, the ordinances that you adopted, were as a result of the policies and programs in the fourth cycle housing element. That covered the time period 2006 to 2014. Fifth cycle is what we're kicking off tonight. This looks out 8 years into the future from now to 2021. What is different with this fifth cycle is that there is a hard and firm deadline to adopt the document. In the fourth cycle, the due date for the housing element was 2008, but there's even some jurisdictions that have not yet adopted their fourth cycle housing element, and that's okay under the old law. But now we have new law that says there is a firm deadline, and if you don't meet that deadline, there is a penalty that you have to update your housing element twice as often on a 4-year cycle rather than an 8-year cycle. In Ventura County and the Skag region, that deadline is February 12th of next year, which is 120 days from the due date of October 15th. So It is our determined objective to have an adopted housing element prior to that date so that your city manager and your community development director don't have to go through this process again in 4 years. You're all familiar with the document itself and what's in there. So what we're going to be doing is going through and updating where necessary, fine-tuning where appropriate, and if it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it. It's an updating process. I know that there was concern in the last cycle about how old some of the data was in the housing element. For example, 2000 census data, you saw a lot of tables in the current housing element referencing 2000 census data. So we're going to be replacing all that 2000 census data with more recent information, but still, it's, we have, life goes on and we have a moving target here, and so 2010 census data is now 3 years old, and so you are going to see some information that's several years old, even though we are updating. One of the key bits of information is the needs assessment, and probably the most important number that people look at in that needs assessment is the regional housing needs assessment. That's the growth numbers that drive the need to demonstrate your adequate sites, which was the primary reason for the adoption of the SPL overlay last time. We're also going to update resources and constraints. Resources are not only land where housing can be built, but also things like financial and administrative resources that can be brought to the table to help facilitate the production of housing. Constraints are those things that the city has control over primarily, such as land use regulations and zoning, development standards. We're going to be talking about height limits and densities and things like that. Another key part of the new housing element will be a performance evaluation. That is, if you will, looking in the rearview mirror and seeing what's been accomplished over this past cycle. How many new housing units have been built? Have housing units been rehabilitated? What has been the track record of implementing the programs and policies from the previous housing element? And then all of that information is used in order to update and fine-tune the goals, the policies, the programs in the document. In the last cycle, you'll recall the RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment allocation to Ojai was 433 units. And what's important about that number is the portion of it that's in the very low and the low categories, which was 164 of the 433. The reason why the 164 is very important is because those are the numbers that translate under state law into high density. State law establishes this proxy, if you will, a proxy of density for affordability. So state law says in small communities, a density of 20 units per acre is necessary in order to facilitate affordable housing. If the density is lower than that, then the cost per unit gets higher because the cost is spread over fewer units. So that's the magic of the 20 units per acre. In the fifth cycle, the RHNA is a little bit less, 371 units as compared to the 433 last time, and the very low and low portion is 146 units. So it's 18 fewer units that have to be accommodated this time as compared to last time. Just wanted to refresh your memories on what we mean when we say things like very low income and low income. And I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but if we take, for example, the term low income and low income housing, these are determined by state and federal law. It's a formula, and it's based on the median income for the entire county. So in Ventura County, the 2013 estimate is a median income of just under $90,000 a year. And you remember from your statistics class, median is the point that half are above and half are below. These are benchmarked to a hypothetical 4-person family. So the the midpoint of income for four-person families in Ventura County is about $90,000 a year. The state publishes a table of income limits that defines what these different terms mean. Ballpark, low income means about 80% of the median income, but then the state has adjustments for what they call high housing cost areas. So you see on this chart that the income limit for a low-income household in Ventura County is about $71,000 a year. That's not exactly 80% of the $89,300, but it's got an adjustment in there because Ventura County is considered a high housing cost area. So, bottom line, when I use the term a low-income household, any place in Ventura County, that means a household whose annual income, gross income, is not more than $71,000 a year, adjusted for family size. And you can see the other categories, very low, moderate, and above moderate. Each of those have a corresponding income limit that's associated with it. The important implication of these numbers is that state law requires every jurisdiction to demonstrate that they have enough capacity with appropriate zoning and development standards so that they could accommodate their RHNA number. And I know that you've been through this before in the last couple of years, so you understand this. This is not a new concept. The state does not require that the units be built. The state does not require that the units be affordable. The state does require that you demonstrate that you have general plan and zoning designations on certain sites, that the capacity for development of those sites is at least your RHNA number, and especially for the very low and the low. So that 146 units is a magic minimum. Again, density, 20 units per acre, is the proxy for affordability. So the key issues that it's my understanding, based on talking to Rob, reviewing the transcripts and so forth, is that there are, in addition to updating the document, there are 4 key issues that we're going to be considering as we go through this process over the next 6 months or so. The first has to do with the adequate sites that the city has through its zoning, and that's primarily the new SPL zone that was adopted a few months ago. The second issue, and I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail, I just want to quickly lay them out. The second is the height limit issue. Thirdly, the topic of new regulations regarding mixed use. And the fourth is inclusionary regulations. So let me go back to the first one, the adequate sites issue. And maybe let me pause here for a second and give you my thoughts about what I would appreciate hearing back as part of this meeting. What I would like us to all think about, because we are kicking off the process and we're not making any final decisions tonight, what I would appreciate is hearing from the council and the commission what your fundamental interests and values are. I already have some ideas about what those are, but I would like us to reiterate those fundamental interests. I've done a fair amount of work in conflict resolution, and in conflict resolution they talk about the difference between the interests of a party and the position of a party. So we want to focus on the interests. That is, what are the core values and concerns that you have? Because as we go through this process, as your technical staff, consultant and planner staff, there are various decision points and things that we will have to go through. So if we understand the clear direction in terms of your interests, then that would be very helpful to us as we put the words on the paper and so forth. And let me give you an example of what I mean when I say interest versus a more specific position, maybe. On height limit. Let's say a height limit of no more than X number of feet is desired. Okay, that's a clear and objective number, but what is it trying to accomplish? What is the interest there? So is the interest to protect the visual character of the community, to protect view sheds, those kinds of core values are interests. And so as we go through this discussion, I would like to hear those kinds of things to give us direction on how we craft the language and how we do the negotiation with the state that's going to be necessary. So, okay, coming back to the matter at hand then. We have a number of sites that were designated with this SPL overlay. And there is an ordinance that establishes development standards and design objectives and so forth for those different sites. And we have an estimated potential number of units. So what I would like to do at this point, since this is a study session, I would like to hear back from members of the council and the commission what thoughts you have as we go forward on this process with regard to the sites and the designation of sites. Should we be looking at changing the sites, deleting some sites, adding some other sites, or making some other standards, changes to the standards that apply to these sites? So that's just put that in the back of your head, and I'll finish going through this, and then I'll sit down and we can talk. With regard to the topic of height limits, the SPL overlay allows up to 3 stories in some areas. There are development proposals that you may have seen that show a density of 20 units per acre within a 2-story height limit. Building architects call it a building envelope. So it's my understanding that the council and the planning commission would like to revisit the issue of the height limit and see whether it would be acceptable from the state's standpoint to establish a firm cap of 2 stories and X number of feet. Again, I would come back and ask what is the underlying interests that lead us to that position. With regard to the mixed-use overlay, as you know, mixed use is a combination of residential and non-residential on the same property. It could be in a vertical sense where you have maybe commercial on the ground floor and residential above, or it could be horizontal on the site where maybe you have commercial next to the street and behind it you have residential. So there's different ways that mixed use can be structured. An overlay, as you recall from the SPL, it creates an additional option for the property owner. So an overlay is a different kind of a use or configuration that is permissible, but the underlying zoning is still permissible also. So it's an option for the property owner. There are different advantages and disadvantages to different kinds of regulations with regard to mixed use. There's also an issue of whether the city can get low-income RHNA credit for mixed use. One of the concerns that I have is that, you know, HCD has established, or actually the state legislature has established this density threshold of 20 units per acre. And so in order to fit 20 residential units into a mixed-use project on an acre of land so that you get 20 units residential density and also have some other kind of use, that is very difficult within a building envelope of 2 stories. So typically, you will see 2 stories of residential within, in order to get a yield of 20 units per acre. But if you add commercial into the project, now you're taking away space that could be devoted to residential, and it may be very difficult, if not impossible, to get 20 units per acre within the same or a compatible building envelope of that height. And so one of the questions for discussion tonight is,
Is that
yes.
20 gross or net? By definition.
It's, I'm hesitating because there is sometimes not a clear answer to that. It depends on how the gross and net is defined. Ordinarily, your density, if you use net, your density, the number becomes higher because the denominator is smaller. So I think in most situations, a net density would be okay in order to calculate and arrive at that number. Yes.
I have a question, because I'm going to forget.
Yeah.
You are required to have 20 units per acre and have it qualify for low income, correct? You can have a BMU with 10 that has fewer units than 20 units and still have to qualify as low income if the price of the unit is
Yeah,
correct?
that's right. If you have an affordable project that, I mean, it's a real project that has financial assistance associated with it, and it is deed restricted, then yes, it doesn't matter what the density is. You can count those units in the affordable category.
So if you have enough land to accommodate your numbers, keep it at 2 stories, still have it at 2 stories.
Yes.
You're fine.
Yes. Yes, if you have a real project.
I understand.
If we're talking just about vacant or, a parcel that's underutilized and there's no specific proposal on that site, then HCD looks at your allowable density. And it has to allow 20 units per acre for HCD to give you credit for that property as a site. It gets, you start peeling the onion and it gets tricky sometimes.
So what you're saying is it's vacant land, you've got to go to 20 units per acre.
In order to get RHNA credit,
To get RHNA credit.
to show adequate
If you want
sites.
BMU, that forces you to go to 3 stories.
If you want to get low-income RHNA credit,
Right.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, and then, just a couple of examples of mixed-use developments around town. On Montgomery Street.
Do you have any idea of the density of, say, that first project? Not this one.
I do not. Rob, do you have any idea of the density of any of these few photos that we were going to show?
I can bring that back to the council and the commission. I don't have that off the top of my head, but I did want to point out for this project, this is the old firehouse, and it has both vertical mixed use and horizontal mixed use because there's a unit above the fire station. So that's the vertical component. And then at the back of the property, that driveway that goes along the south side of the building, there's residences back there, and I'm not sure how many units are back there. I was going to, if I had an idea of that, I could give you an estimate on the acreage.
Site is one, right? Yes,
One up top and one in the back.
one.
All right, so 2 units, and that's not a very big property.
Yeah, so if that were, what, like a 4,000 square foot lot, you think, maybe, or
That's probably more like an 8,000 or 6,000 at least.
bigger? Okay. Okay, so if it were a 6,000 square foot lot, then, and there were 2 units, you said? Okay, so that's about maybe somewhere between 12, 14, 15 units per acre, something like that. Another property on North Montgomery Street that's a mix of commercial and residential. And then on South Signal Street. So just a couple of examples of mental picture that I'm sure all of you have seen around town. Okay, then finally the fourth topic that was on the list of issues is inclusionary. As you recall, inclusionary means a requirement that affordable housing be included as part of a residential development, or that as an alternative that the project developer pay an in lieu fee as a substitute or in lieu of providing the affordable units. This topic has gotten a lot more complicated in the last few years because of a couple of court decisions. And I think you've heard about those before. There was a Palmer decision and a Patterson decision. In a nutshell, those decisions take away cities' rights to require inclusionary units for rental projects because it violates state rent control law, the Costa-Hawkins Act. The Patterson case has to do with the fairness of a requirement or an imposition that's imposed upon a developer, so that there has to be a proportionality between what is required of the developer and the problem that requirement is intended to solve. So it's a pretty complicated legal topic. With regard to the housing element and HCD and getting the housing element certified, HCD takes a neutral position on inclusionary housing. And I could talk to you at greater length about why I think that is, but I think the short answer is that, like all governmental organizations, they have their constituency. And I think the Building Industry Association is one of the constituencies of the State Housing Department. And the Building Industry Association is generally quite opposed to inclusionary requirements. So HCD takes a neutral position. They say if a city has inclusionary requirements, that's fine. They just need to analyze those and discuss them in the housing element and make sure that they are not onerous in the sense of driving up the cost of the other market rate housing units that are part of the project. If a city does not have inclusionary requirements, that's fine. There is no mandate to do so. There's a wide range of options that different cities have adopted in terms of inclusionary. There are differences of percentage, differences of income categories. I remember quite a few years ago, shortly after the city of Goleta was incorporated, they were going through this process trying to get their housing element certified. And one of the ideas that they came up with was to simply impose inclusionary requirements that were equal to their RHNA numbers, which amounted to about 55% of all units being affordable. So they first ran this by HCD, and HCD said, basically, no, that's too restrictive. In other words, that would, you wouldn't get any housing because it's so onerous that it would be financially infeasible for a developer to comply with those requirements. So, I mean, that's the most extreme example I have heard of. Most cities that do have inclusionary requirements, it's typically in the range of 10, 15, 20% of the total units being affordable or in the lower income categories.
And the state seems to be okay with that percentage?
Yes.
The 10, 15%?
Yes. What the state likes to see is, in concert with the requirement, that cities sweeten the deal by offering some incentives. This could be through the standard density bonus provisions of state law, but it could be outside of the density bonus rules. Many cities used to have money from redevelopment agencies. A lot of that is gone. There's some successor agencies that maybe have a little bit of tools or money at their disposal, but then there's grant funds. And so HCD may say, all right, if you have an inclusionary requirement, we want to see your commitment to do something to help the developer. So maybe that is help them put together grant applications to the feds and the state for affordable housing funds, even though you, city, may not have any money yourself, but you have maybe some of your staff can help the developer compile the data and whatever they need to support their application. One of the most interesting things that I've heard recently on the topic of inclusionary is sometimes referred to as a land value recapture concept. And this, the jurisdiction that I'm most familiar with was the city of Santa Ana, coincidentally where your city attorney served as city attorney for many years. The land value recapture concept says that as opposed to a conventional type of inclusionary requirement where we adopt an ordinance that says every residential development has to provide a certain percentage of affordable units, we're not going to do that. We're only going to impose this inclusionary requirement when we upzone property. So if a property owner comes to the city and says, my property is now zoned for low-rise commercial development, and I would like entitlement to develop that at a slightly higher intensity through a mixed use or maybe switching it from low-intensity industrial or commercial to residential, higher density residential. That the city up front establish what the rules are for providing affordable housing when that increase in entitlement is granted. So they might say, and I don't remember what the numbers that Santa Ana ultimately adopted, but they would say, okay, the developer comes in and says, I have this 2-acre plot of land that's zoned industrial, please rezone it to allow condos. So the ordinance says, if we rezone your property, you will be required to provide X percentage of affordable units in that development. So it's upfront. Why upfront is good is because it removes some of the uncertainty of the development process, and most developers that I've talked to will say the things that kill them are uncertainty and delays and so forth. If they know in advance what the rules are, they can pencil that into their pro formas and crunch the numbers, and they can know what they've got. No, it's not a roll of the dice with whatever the city decides to impose on their particular project. So that land value recapture concept, as far as I know, it is not widespread, but it is very interesting to me. And just to wrap up the formal part of the presentation, just wanted to go over what the steps are in this process. After tonight's meeting, we'll gather input from the council, from the planning commission, from the community, and then the next formal public meeting would be a planning commission meeting to review a draft of the housing element document. Additional public review, comments, feedback, and so forth, revise as necessary, and then bring it to the city council for its review, revisions, public comments, and so forth, and then culminating in the council's authorization for us to submit that draft up to state HCD to begin the state review process. State has 60 days to give us their comments on that draft. It's our expectation that during the HCD review process, we would commence the CEQA review, and then once we get HCD's comments back, we would work on additional revisions, clarifications, and so forth that the state brings up as part of their review. Then there would be a second round of meetings with the Planning Commission and the Council to review the revised document based on HCD's comments. And then, if necessary, we may have to submit the document for a second round of review with HCD. Several of the cities that I'm working with now have been able to get HCD's acceptance of the document on the first submittal with some minor revisions. So I think that's possible. It really depends on the nature of the changes that the council and the planning commission wants to make to the document. So that concludes my formal presentation. I'm going to go back and sit down, and then we can talk.
Any questions by the council or the commission of Mr. Douglas at this point? Troy?
Well, maybe a question for you and Rob. On the cycle 4, the inclusionary, we changed that language, as I recall, to or, from or to and, to have low, very low, and moderate. We made a change on that. Did we get any feedback from HCD on that, or have we presented it yet?
Well, we didn't have any specific program implemented for the inclusionary housing. We had a program identified in the housing element, but what we decided in the end was to defer the specifics of the inclusionary housing program to this cycle. So, and we haven't gotten any feedback from HCD on any of the changes that we've made since they certified our housing element. So we will be getting that. And I just wanted to add one thing. I don't want to prematurely dismiss the residential mixed use as something that we can only go for if we can achieve 20 units per acre on those sites, because I don't think that's realistic. I don't think we're going to get 20 units per acre and commercial on any of the sites. I don't think that was the concept that the Planning Commission had in mind when I discussed that with them. So what John's saying is that in order for us to, for certain, get credit for very low and low income units as part of the residential mixed use program, we would have to guarantee up to 20 units per acre on those sites. But there may be something where the density is less than that we can explore with HCD, particularly because of our traffic policy in the general plan. Right now, the only projects that get a exemption from that traffic policy are affordable housing projects. And if we craft this program, the mixed use program, to allow to identify that a certain number of those units at a certain density, even if we need to even identify a density, but to make sure that those units that are achieved in mixed use are indeed affordable housing units, and then have the entirety of the project exempt from the traffic policies, that might be a way to demonstrate to HCD that we are actually increasing our capacity to generate affordable units. So I think that would be my take as a starting point for discussion is let's see if there's a way we can craft the residential mixed use that doesn't require 20 units per acre density, and see if by virtue of our general plan peculiarities or uniqueness that we can provide some ammunition for HCD to accept that as meeting some of our obligation. And if the answer is no, I think there's still some benefit to looking at that program as a blight reduction program to the city. Because what we did hear from some of the developers is that the SPL overlay was not the golden ticket, so to speak. It was not going to necessarily induce them to develop the property in and of itself, but that they would be much more interested in some sort of a residential mixed-use program. So if there's a way to get units out of that and satisfy the state and take up some of the pressure on the very low and moderate income units, then that is what I would hope that we can flesh out through this process.
Commissioner Crabtree.
May I? I wouldn't assume that we can't do the 20 units per acre on with 2 stories. If I did my math right, the firehouse site is 11.6 units per acre. So we might want to look into that a little closer.
Any other comments or questions of Mr. Douglas at this point? No? We do have some members of the public here. Is there anyone in the public that wishes to address us or have a question for Mr. Douglas? Yes, Dale. If you could come up so that we can hear you.
I'm sorry that I'm late, but I was wondering, did you address the amnesty program at all in your discussion? I did not. Well, can I ask a question about it? Assuming that we have an amnesty program. If a person, let's say, has a converted garage, and it meets the requirements, and it's in a neighborhood that's zoned R1, will then that become an R2 neighborhood, or will it affect only that? I mean, how does it work when you have rental units in an R1 area? Am I jumping ahead?
No, that's fine. Under state law, a second residential unit is not considered to be inconsistent with R1 zoning. I mean, state law requires cities to allow second units based on certain standards unless there's a real strong health, public safety reason why it's not acceptable.
Thank you.
Add to that. If I could, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah.
I just also want to clarify that the key issues that we identified are key issues for this update, for the Cycle 5 update. That doesn't mean that we're going to discontinue programs that were identified in the Cycle 4 update. And a key component of that was the second unit amnesty program. So we will still be pursuing that program. We've actually got a few I don't want to say they're applications, but we've had 3 or 4 interested parties come in and say that they want to take advantage of this program already. It's on the books now, it's effective, so we can start taking in those applications and reviewing them. I think the challenge for us as part of this cycle will be to see how many units HCD allows us to allocate towards the second unit program, because they were very generous the last cycle, and they may be a little bit more skeptical this time around. So that's an unknown at this point. We really won't know until we submit the draft to HCD how many units we can obtain credit for. And I do think one of the things Dale was alluding to was that there was some discussion as part of the housing element adoption itself as to whether we want to broaden the types of second units that become eligible for the program, because right now we do not allow converted garages. That was an explicit thing that we said we didn't want to start. But if there's input from the community as part of this housing element cycle that's a really important thing to revisit, then that could be part of our work. This is the very beginning, the first meeting that we're having on Cycle 5, so it's an opportunity to take that kind of input in. And I have not gone into detail with John. He's just come on board very recently, so I will make sure he's fully aware of all the nuances to the second unit amnesty program.
Anyone else from the public wishing to ask a question or speak? I don't see anyone, so what we'll do is we'll move on to the request that Mr. Douglas had with regard to interests and designation of sites, and I'll start it off, and then we'll go to Chair Nicklin. As far as the overall interest that I see that we need to have in our housing element is that we need to preserve our small town character, and that includes the height limits. And we also are extremely concerned with preserving our natural resources, principally our water. And as far as the designation of sites, I thought that the Planning Commission and the Council did a really good job designating the sites in the last cycle. So I'm happy with those sites that were selected. Lawrence?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. My feeling is the small town feel. That's something I feel very strongly about. Something that concerns me is the traffic, the extra traffic through our town. Also our water issues, another big thing, and particularly now with this drought cycle we're in, and we don't know how long it's going to be. So that needs to be looked at, I think, really carefully. And then one thing that's kind of worried me from the very beginning is the height restrictions as well. I feel that 3-story is like a no-no as far as I'm concerned. So that's all I have to add. Thanks.
Mayor Pro Tem Strobel?
One question I have is, let's say that we complete our Cycle 5 housing element, we submit it on time, the state authorizes it, and after it has been authorized by or certified by the state, adopted by the city, If we then find that we have constraints that prevent us from achieving our goals, objectives, is it possible to go back and amend the housing element?
Yes, it's always possible to go back and amend a housing element or any element of the general plan. When you do amend a housing element, though, there's a requirement that it be submitted up to the state, and you go through that review process again.
And the reason I'm asking about that is, at this point in time, we don't really have updated traffic and air pollution. We don't have an updated reports on constraints. We don't have an updated report on water. We don't have any of that. And we do have a deadline coming up. The other thing that I was wondering about, and this is just wondering, did the village mixed use concept, is that working for Ojai? Are they successful? Would we, if it's not working for Ojai, then maybe we need to change our focus. And I simply don't know, but that would be my second. The other thing is, I believe it is our intent to preserve our views of the surrounding hillsides. I don't know how that is best done, but that is a priority for the citizens.
Commissioner Crabtree?
Thank you. Well, I'm a little frustrated that we're doing this again when we just finished one. And even during that, there was frustration that we're doing that instead of the real planning that we wanted to do. And I know we need to do this. I'm wondering if there's a way that we can, I'm looking at this, all these meetings, and I'm wondering if we could capture something that we really want to do while we're doing all these other meetings. In other words, we've been wanting to do neighborhood plans, and they might tie together. For instance, if we did, in alignment with this, we did a neighborhood plan for the pedestrian enhancement zone. That's my thought on it.
Councilwoman Clapp?
I jotted some things down. Welcome, John. One thing was you talked about was that the state HCD will review past performance when they consider you do element. And is that really fair, for lack of a better word, considering the economy over the last whatever? Because you say the city's not required to develop, so how can we be held accountable for no development when the economy has not been developing anywhere?
Yeah, and I would just say that the state doesn't punish cities for housing not being built unless it was the city's, unless the city acted as the primary obstacle to the housing not being built. So the market is down. Very few cities are seeing much housing built, market rate housing or affordable housing.
Okay, that being said, we have an amnesty program with Cycle 4, yet we were very late in adopting Cycle 4. And is there a possibility that because of our late adoption that they will say you didn't perform well in the amnesty program and we're not going to renew that concept?
No, I don't. Short answer, I don't think so. And with regard to the amnesty program, while I haven't thoroughly reviewed it and I haven't discussed it at length with Rob, I am familiar with the concept. City of Malibu adopted a similar amnesty program as part of their housing element this last time. You may hear me say something over and over again, and that is that HCD looks at housing elements as a package. And there are some requirements that are more or less chiseled in stone, and there are other requirements where there is some wiggle room. And so the art of of the deal, so to speak, is getting a package that HCD thinks is okay. Now, there's provision of state law that says you can take credit for second units at the same pace that they have been approved and built in your previous planning cycle. That's the starting point. If a city makes a significant policy change, such as an amnesty program, then that's something that HCD would take into account in the total package. So they're looking at, in Ojai's case, they're looking at your SPL overlay, they're looking at your amnesty, they're looking at VMU, a variety of things as a package. And so some parts of that package are chiseled in stone, that you have to allow at least 20 units per acre because that's state law. But how much credit the city thinks is reasonable to count towards second units under the amnesty program and so forth, sometimes it's very hard to pin down with precise numbers what HCD is thinking, because oftentimes they won't tell you exactly what they're thinking.
Here's a thought with the, for example, the converted garages in an amnesty program. You mentioned that the very low income is $44,650 and low is $71,200, which is just laughable, of course, because Ojai is the second poorest community in Ventura County, and these units are renting for less than any very low or low income project that would be built by an affordable housing developer would rent for. So would that be one of the carrots that you could give HCD as far as allowing us to do a significant portion of amnesty in order to preserve the affordability, true affordability for residents of the town?
All I could say is it's one factor of many that are considered.
I think it's something worth trying, because I see that a lot with these affordable housing projects. They go in and they plow down like they're doing this in Oxnard, as a matter of fact, a wagon wheel. They're going in, they're bulldozing a trailer park, and they're going to put in an affordable housing project, and the units are going to rent for more than the trailer park did, which had a true sense of community as well. So these people are being displaced, and there's not really going to be truly an affordable place for them to go because the illusion of affordable housing being built is such. Okay, now on to something else. So yes, I'd like to include converted garages in our amnesty program. Traffic, I agree completely, is horrendous. This county just did a recent count, and they said our numbers have gone down in traffic, which is laughable. I think anybody here in town would agree that we're gridlock and bumper to bumper from 150 all the way back to Timbuktu. So I think, and I know that affordable projects are exempt from traffic, so I know that it really doesn't matter, but it is a constraint. Regarding the 3 stories, this 3-story has not only the impact of damaging the feel of the community, but it also damages our local economy. Because one of the things people say when they come to our community is that, oh, this is so great, it's like a real small town, there's no change, you can see the mountains, and they're coming here for relief from the urbanization of the rest of the state. So it is not a stretch to say to HCD that 3-story development would destroy our local economy. We're in a valley, we don't have the ability to have any sort of other major industry come into the community to support our economy. We're tourism, and it would destroy the tourism economy as well as ruin the character for the rest of the community. Water, of course, is an ongoing concern. Lake Casitas is at 67%. It's going to be at 60 by November, and they say it'll be by 50% at the end of next summer, which will be, at that point, will be rationed. So water is true constraint. It's not a manufactured one. That's it. Thank you.
Commissioner Becker?
I would agree with my peers on the height limit. That's a major community concern, I think, as well as one of ours. As far as the map goes, the new numbers should provide a less we should be able to lessen the numbers, the total overall numbers too. I think I figured about, we could lessen it by about 30 to 33 units. Does that sound about right to you? Based on some quick math I did. So, you know, there's what we file, and then there's reality. And of course, all of us here would like to get back to reality at some point. And I think that we need to have both conversations somewhat together. The purpose of the housing element that we did the last cycle was to get it done quickly, and to limit its impact. And that's why there's so few parcels. And I think, personally, I still feel that that's a good way to go, as long as we have a discussion about what we really want. And what I would favor is, you know, where someone does a development, you know, whatever that is. In Ojai, typically our parcels are smaller, so we're talking anywhere from, you know, 2 to 8 units. To be able to give something to that developer, if you put in 1 or 2 affordable or something close to affordable, would be closer to reality than what the housing element actually says we're going to do. That's something that actually can happen and could happen with our developers. And, you know, we knew that developers are, by the way, developers are usually just people that own property that live in Ojai. Not very many of them actually live out of town. So we're talking about people that are here. They look at that HCD thing and go, that's a nightmare. They don't even want to do it. The ones that want to do it generally are the third party, you know, that come in and say, well, we could convert these, or we could do a bigger project and have a lot of affordable, and they'll go out and help you do the paperwork, get the grant money, blah, blah, blah. And we've seen a couple of those projects come through. Very few of them actually happened because of one reason or another. The money didn't develop, or something just didn't happen. So I would like to see that we actually maybe change one of the densities on that OSUSD property. That was one of the things we struggled with, Rob, when we were working on those numbers to hit the number, the magic number. I think we added more density to that property. We also talked about maybe, I think we added one more property too. Maybe it was a Jim Miller property, I don't remember.
We added bowling alley.
Was it bowling alley?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe pulling back a little bit on that somewhere. I think maybe I would favor lowering the density on OSUSD. I just couldn't see, and that's something I think we need to talk about as when it comes back through, because that was a meat of the discussion, you know, how many parcels versus density, and we ended up bumping it up to meet the requirement. So that's probably worth another discussion. But again, I really agree with Commissioner Crabtree. I think we just need to get a housing element together, limit its impact as much as possible, and then talk about what really would happen in our community and what the community wants.
Thank you. Our newest commissioner, Commissioner Osborne.
Thank you. Yes, well, I think most of the points have already been made. The one point I would like to just add is to refine this interest that we have with respect to the 3-story. And yeah, it's small town character, and the view shed. We want to maintain the view shed because that's kind of what makes the character of the community, is that you can look up and see the hills around us and avoid the sort of concrete canyon. The thing I want to add is really that we want to maintain this human scale. And if you were standing right next to a 3-story structure, then it's really beyond human scale. And so there's a couple of ways to achieve that human scale. One is setback from you know, the property line. And so even with a 2-story, we maybe we would insist on having maybe the 1-story at first and then set back to a 2nd story. But anyway, I think this human scale is the concept that we want to maintain, so that we're not not dwarfed by some kind of structure. Thank you.
Commissioner Foster.
Well, tagging on to Commissioner Osborne's comments on height, I concur with everybody that I think 3 stories doesn't fit our community. I'm a little apprehensive about defining a specific height limit, though, because I believe that with design review in place, we have the ability to control that. And I think I saw somewhere in here 25 feet. I just think that's it's restrictive as an architect. There could be certain circumstances that would present opportunity to enhance aesthetics and fit the character of the town where it would exceed that. So I just am a little apprehensive about adopting a specific height, at least in that range of numbers. But I agree that we have to guard our height, building heights in the community. The other thing I'm interested in is, and it's being touched on, is the mixed-use overlay concept. Seems to be a question about how the RHNA numbers would be credited towards in such that type of development. So I'm not really clear in my own mind what that looks like. But that said, I believe from that the possibility for economic development, there lies the possibility for in those terms for developers an incentive to build out. I think you take a specific property, it's probably the best way to explain my idea, like the bowling alley or Jim Miller's property. The potential there to do a mixed-use project, I think, is fairly ideal. It brings community to those areas with pedestrian and social and cultural interaction. I think it's really something that we should explore and get into deeper and just not dismiss because it's additional housing in a commercial area. But I think there may be economic incentives for people who own those properties, like the Millers and whoever else, for looking at in those terms.
And what you're referring to is existing C properties, commercial properties.
Correct.
With an overlay that would be a VMU, correct? Or
Yeah,
something to that
I
effect.
don't know if VMU is the actual terminology, but
Something to
correct,
that effect.
that sort of thing, yeah.
Okay. Commissioner Nolan?
Well, I generally agree with my fellow council members and commissioners. I do have concerns about the water and traffic issues. Also with the view shed and the scale of a two-story, which I think should be the limit. But as Commissioner Foster mentioned, I'm not so sure putting the 25-foot limit is the best way to go. I think it may limit different styles of architecture and the roofing. So once again, I would like to keep to 2 stories, but I think that should be explored a little further to see is that the magic number or not, or do we leave it at the 30 feet? I'm also open to modifying the village mixed use as it's presently zoned to allow maybe a unit is just residential. I'd rather see something being rented or leased and used rather than having something be left vacant. And so in other words, maybe it's residential for a while and it rotates back to the village mixed use. But I would, once again, rather see it occupied than vacant. I would also be interested in seeing the business professional be added to the commercial in the possible overlay. And, and then I have one question, because we've been talking about possibly the converted garages being accepted, and I'm wondering, in that case, if a garage was accepted, would that property owner be required to add covered parking as our code now? Is that something we'd have to explore and write into that, or make a?
Yeah, that would be something we would want to look into and decide if that's another standard that we would waive in the case of an amnesty program.
Thank you.
Councilman Lara.
Well, welcome, Mr. Douglas. First of all, I agree with my fellow council member commissioners. And just to start off with answering your question about the fundamental interest, I agree with Mayor Blatz that small character and our natural resources, I think, is huge in this community. And I think that was shown with the implementing Cycle 4. And then I also agree with Commissioner Crabtree when he says frustration, because there are a lot of other issues, I think, that are more practical for this community. With that being said, I'm just interested, why even have the demographic data when my understanding is that really we're not applying it to this cycle, we're applying it to next cycle. It's a question, and I think that Mayor Pro Tem Strobel said that her understanding is going and amending our housing element so that we could include, would we have to do that? Because my understanding is including our updated data for water or traffic review doesn't really affect this cycle. Is that correct, or?
Right, it doesn't affect the RHNA numbers, and the cycle, the fourth cycle, ends in October. And so everything that's in your current housing element will be superseded by the new document.
Okay.
And we're required by state law to update all of the demographics and so forth.
But our RHNA numbers are still there, right?
RHNA numbers are cast in concrete.
Okay. But I mean, with that being said, I don't disagree that I think we should update our demographics anyways. I think that's a point that we could stress in this housing element. Also, I do agree with, I have mixed feelings about the overlay for the mixed use sites. I don't know if it really does fit Ojai. It was just kind of surprise for me. I'd rather focus anything else in an amnesty program, really get that going, and look at to see if we do agree that garage conversions classify as adding affordable housing. Inclusionary, I just don't understand if it's worth pursuing. If we just want to get this element, I agree, focusing again on programs that we want to get through. I don't know if it's worth focusing any of those two issues. With the height, again, I am concerned about the height restriction with the SPL, and if we could pursue the 2-story limit, and I don't know what your opinion is, if we're going to be successful with that or not. I'd rather do it that way instead of doing a height restriction, because I am also concerned about the flexibility when it comes to architects being able to design, their buildings. But it's always made me laugh when they say about affordability. It seems like affordability isn't really capturing the real definition of what it's supposed to be. I mean, it seems like affordability is more market value the way the state's putting it. And so it just, then again, I just feel like we should move through a fifth cycle so we could get through and focus really on what programs we could take advantage of. So, thank you.
Commissioner Merck, last but not least.
Thank you, sir. We have heard a lot of input this evening. I'm going to focus mostly on interests and values, I think, at this point. I think you've gotten a lot of real specifics from people, but I'd have to say, in general, when I think about the city as a whole, I'd really like Ojai to remain a real a dynamic, kind of viable place that is able to evolve over time. And a lot of the discussion I'm hearing tonight really disturbs me, because I see us sort of putting a lot of constraints on what can happen in the future. I'd like to keep all of our options fairly flexible at this point. So I'm pretty much opposed to changing height limits, changing the number of stories you can have, that sort of thing that we have in our zoning element. I'm really hoping that we can end up with a process that kind of brings us towards having more density downtown, having less kind of sprawl spread throughout the city, and having a kind of vibrancy in the downtown that I think would be terrific, and would also, I mean, I think the more people we can get in a denser area, the less traffic we're going to have, because people are going to be able to take advantage of public transit and options besides using their car. They can walk places. So I would like to focus on those things as we go forward with the plan. I think it's, as Paul was saying, I think it's really important to keep in mind what it is we're trying to achieve as a city as we go forward on this, and not, it's really easy with this process to get all bogged down in the specifics of it, but I think we can keep that uppermost in our minds. I think we'll end up with a better housing element, and really, ultimately, I think we'd like to work on a neighborhood plan and a general plan for the city that really makes sense going forward, that can last for, years into the future, decades into the future, rather than something that just gets us through this cycle that we have to go through in the next 6 months or whatever. So I'd just like us to keep that in mind.
All right, thank you. Anyone in the public wanting to make a comment? Sure, come forward, please.
Hello, Martin Hartman, designer in Ojai. I had a couple points here, like in the discussion about height. I've worked in some jurisdictions and they have a solar bulk plane ordinance. It's also to ensure that properties don't build 2 stories right on a property where you could get solar access, like on a roof or something. So it's a solar access issue as well. I think that should be considered. And then another jurisdiction I'm working in, instead of 3 stories, they have something where they call it a half story. And so they can have technically a 3rd story, but the area of the story is limited to particulars of the site, like the site coverage. So like if you develop a denser downtown, you could have like a 3rd story, but it's very limited. So, the mass of the building is set back, as this commissioner was saying, but you don't necessarily limit that, and you can, do different things with that. Those are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
John Fowler with People's Self-Help Housing, and it was great hearing the comments today, and I think they were very informative. We've been building houses, affordable housings, from Ventura all the way to Paso Robles, and in fact I was late tonight because we were making a presentation for a housing project in Santa Barbara, and they were dealing with the very same issues that you guys are. Setbacks, landscaping, water, resources, everything. So I think that this is achievable. They didn't want to go. We had originally started with 4 stories to try and get to that density, but we were able, with setbacks and various other things, listen to the community, go back and really came up with a project that was really great for them. So I do think that you guys are headed in the right plan, headed in the right direction, and some great comments. And obviously, all the places on the Central Coast are looking for view sheds and water resources. So these are challenges for every jurisdiction, and so you're in a good company, I guess I would say. So anyhow, it was a pleasure to hear your comments tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the audience wishing to address us? Dale. Sure.
I agree very much so with what John Merck said, and I really think that keeping affordability is so vital. It's what Severo was saying, because as a realtor, I have people coming in my office every day looking for low-income housing, and what they call low-income housing on some of the housing element figures I've seen is really not low-income housing. And these are decent people, they're not ragtag people. They're young people coming back to Ojai, trying to find a place to live, and nothing is affordable for them. And I think that keeping affordability, the reality of affordability in mind is important. And I really treasure our small town feeling, and I really hope that that stays the way it is. We keep our traffic and water and all that stuff in mind. So thank you.
Thank you.
Dale, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
When you say these young people are coming back, they're returning, they probably were raised here, this sort of thing, and they can't afford to buy here, can you give me a general range, a price range of what would get them back into the community?
They're not looking to buy, they're looking to rent. They can't afford to buy.
Strictly rentals, not even
yeah,
buy.
I mean, well, we have a lot of people that want to buy too, but they'll come in the office and say, "What do you have for $200,000?" Well, nothing. Mobile home
Doesn't
if you're
exist,
over
yeah.
65 or something. But no, these are people looking for rentals, and there's just very, very little rentals here. That they get a converted garage even sometimes too expensive. They want like $600 or $700 rent, and that's unreasonable. And especially if there are 2 of them, and sometimes it's a couple. So I know that to some extent that's unreasonable, but I'd like to see us make it reasonable.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dale. All right, after hearing everybody's comments, any further comments by the council or the commission? Yes, Mayor Pro Tem Strobel.
Question regarding the SCAG report. When SCAG compiles their report specific for Ojai, have they just taken a percentage of 10 cities plus county area and applied that percentage to Ojai, or is it actually specific to Ojai?
If you're referring to the RHNA number that's been allocated.
Well, SCAG just did a report, the demographics, the income, etc. We received it about 3 weeks ago.
Have you seen that, Rob? I'm not quite sure what she's referring to.
It's part of the regional transportation plan. It's some of the initial discussions for the next RHNA, actually. It's part of the regional growth forecast that they're just putting together.
Okay.
And the reason I'm asking is SCAG is going to use that information to determine RHNA numbers for Ojai. So what I'd like to know is if for Ojai, our 4.5 square miles, are we dealing with accurate information? And if not, what can we do about it?
Yes, in a nutshell is it's very important for cities to work with SCAG, to follow their process, to provide feedback whenever SCAG has information that they release for review. I work with a lot of small cities that don't have big staffs, and it's difficult to keep up because the staff is doing the things that they have to do every day, and then this report from SCAG gets dumped on them. So it's a real challenge. But it is important because what comes out the end of the pipe, starts years before. And so these initial reports from SCAG that have growth forecasts and so forth, they gradually over the next few years turn into RHNA numbers 6 or 7 years from now.
Okay, and how compatible does SCAG use the information from the 2010 census to establish their report?
They do, yes, along with other sources.
But if we look strictly at the state's census, would we see different numbers specific to Ojai?
Rob, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, no, I will assure the council that both Rob Clark and I mean, this is a little bit outside of John's scope of work, but he can certainly advise us on this. But certainly Rob Clark and I do not want to see what happened to the city of Ojai. The last 2 RHNA allocations where we got a very high, very unreasonable RHNA allocation. So we're aware of SCAG's baby steps towards the next allocation. Eventually, they will say, okay, this is what we think is going to happen in Ojai in terms of land use and jobs and all those things, and we'll be able to provide input on that. And they'll also eventually say, this is how many units we think you're going to get, like a draft RHNA number before. And so at every step of that process, there's an opportunity for city staff to weigh in and get things a little bit more realistic. When we just look at the straight out population trend for, when we're talking housing, we look at population trend for Ojai. Clearly, what we've seen in the last several years justifies a very low RHNA allocation for the next cycle. So, I would be very surprised if we're even up to 200 units, which is what we had in 2005 to 2006. It could be something, well under that. So it'll be vastly different than the 433 units that we had in cycle 4 and the 371 units that we had in cycle 5. And I think the other important thing that's happened, as the council knows, we've been in contact with SCAG and even tried very hard to get the cycle 5 numbers adjusted and went through the appeal process, went through the meetings down in Los Angeles, and we just were rebuffed. But at least they know that we're interested now, we're watching, we want, and I think they'll be much more sympathetic to our I think we're on their radar now and I don't think we were on their radar the last couple cycles.
Right. What I want to make sure that we do is, and I do feel it is important to the housing element update. I want to make, I would rather see us, the city of Ojai, determine our own demographics and start educating SCAG as to what our city really is and what it can really do, rather than the reactive defensive posture we've always taken.
Yes, Councilwoman Clapp.
Just real quick, let's make sure they know we're only 4.5 square miles. Because I think sometimes I don't think they even know that, honestly, because a lot of people in town don't even know that we're 4.5 square miles. People don't live in town, they think they do, and I have a feeling they don't even know.
And you know, if you look at that demographic study, and we ought to get Mr. Douglas a copy of that, if nothing else, for some interesting reading about demographics of Ojai, and SCAG did a really good job putting it together. It shows that the population of Ojai is decreasing. The school system is decreasing in terms of number of students. Jobs are being lost, yet our numbers are going up, which is kind of an interesting concept. But again, if we show that we have the capacity, that's really all we need. But still, I don't know how we're ever going to fill that capacity if people are leaving town unless we can find, as Dale said, you know, we need some rental units that rent for, I think, $1,000 or less. Yeah.
That's why I think it's so important that we do the amnesty program and be really aggressive about it, and say that make them understand that the income in this community is not $71,000. It isn't even $40,000 for a lot of people. So if we can aggressively, show them that the amnesty program is really the most realistic way to provide affordable housing in this community, I think we could really increase the numbers.
Well, in that study, it shows the median income for Ventura County. It also shows the median income, as I recall, for Ojai.
And what was it?
And it was considerably less.
Yeah.
So if you then used your 80% of what our median income is, the only way we're probably ever going to get any kind of the affordable housing we're looking for is to have the amnesty program, and particularly start approving these converted garage units. And I would welcome the Planning Commission to get a copy of that as well.
Interesting.
Because it's really good. Well, do you take care of doing that, Mr. Mullane? Okay.
If I could ask Mr. Douglas, so what role does rentals play into the RHNA numbers, if any? It sounds like there's a real question there, or it's not allowable.
You mean existing rentals in the community?
In terms of, no, I'm creating new RHNA numbers, meeting our criteria for RHNA numbers. Do rentals fall into that category?
Yeah, the RHNA doesn't distinguish between ownership or rental units.
Okay. So any new apartments?
Yes.
Then could fall within the affordable housing number game? Okay.
Yes.
Any other questions of Mr. Douglas or staff?
I have a comment.
Yep, comments?
And I'm not even sure why this bothers me, but it bothers me. The use of the term amnesty when we're talking about bringing second units into compliance, that actually sends a confusing message for me. Are we talking amnesty for what? So I'd like us to consider a different name for the project. It's about bringing second units into compliance, or the city working with them, but I don't think amnesty maybe is the word that works for me.
You guys have any idea what another name would be? Compliance.
I just jotted down second unit compliance program.
Okay. I like that. That's probably better. Sometimes you can get a whole different message across by just what you call it.
I'm wondering on this, we've talked in planning about, or I have, I don't know if other people agree, but I think there's an opportunity with the economy hopefully picking up. One of the issues that we have as a county is that we have a limit on guest house square footage, and I've always been hammering on that. I think it's too small. because ultimately what we are going to be probably doing as a community is bringing in our, elders. So I'll be living in a guest house and my kids will live in the big house type of thing. And that guest house square footage is too small.
What is it now?
650. 640?
660, I think. 640.
Yeah, have you been in a house that's 640 square feet? It's small. So, I don't know if we can include it in our next cycle, but, we as the city can change that. And to be able to change it to, on certain size parcels to 1,200, then you scale down from there. We actually might get some housing, because then we have people that can afford to refinance their house, that have larger parcels, and actually will put them in. That's what I'm talking about, reality. And if we could maybe include some of that in our next cycle, that can really happen. And it wouldn't change the character of the community. They'll be single story. And quite frankly, every one of us sitting here probably, is looking at doing that. I mean, living in a smaller home as we get older. And it's more realistic, and then it kind of makes sense for this community. It's something we've talked about over the years, but we haven't done what we've really been talking about. So.
Well, I know that the county's limitation on second dwelling units is larger than ours. I can't remember what it starts off at.
Mayor Blatt, it's 1 acre. Anything less than 1 acre cannot have a second dwelling unit.
Oh, okay, in the county? And then I think it's 1,200?
In our area of the county, in our
In the
region.
valley.
It changes once you're out
Okay.
of the valley.
But then it's 1,200 square feet, I think, when it is allowed, isn't it?
Yeah, up to
Okay,
1,200.
and we don't have that same limitation of having to have an acre, do we? For the 640 or 650, I don't believe. So it's something to look at. If it's a larger parcel, maybe we should think about having larger second dwelling units, particularly if we're going to start looking at those as helping for our RHNA numbers, although a 1,200 square foot second dwelling unit may not be necessarily affordable. Any other questions? Yes.
Now, I'm
Mayor Pro Tem
definitely
Strobel.
off the topic now. But when we were, let's just say that second dwelling square footage is 650 feet. Is that the interior living area when we say 650 feet? Is it interior living area as opposed to measuring exterior structure?
It's actually the gross square footage. It's the outside.
So it is, all right. What I'm getting at is with all of the green building that we want to promote, especially here, do we need to expand that? Because if we reduce the interior livability square footage, because we've expanded the structural for green building or whatever, then we're making it even smaller maybe than it has to be. So either we increase the size we allow, or we consider what kind of structure is going up. And I know that's not on topic.
It might not be on topic, but it's a good suggestion. Anybody else? Anything from staff?
Well, I will say some of these concepts are essentially new programs. So if we carry these things forward, we'll be able to let the state know what we think the impact of these new programs are. So, I mean, that's really helpful. None of this, some of this hasn't come up before, at least in the big group setting. So we'll, in addition to the 4 key issues that we raised in the presentation, we'll try to flesh out some of these other ideas and concepts in more detail and see if they can become new programs in the housing element.
Great. Councilman Lara?
I just have one more question for Mr. Douglas. When it comes to affordability, do we have any right to change that language, what its affordability means to Ojai? Or
In terms of the definition of what is an affordable unit,
affordable.
unfortunately not. It's set in state law.
But that actually is to our benefit. Because if we restricted it to what we consider to be affordable in Ojai, that limits the kind of development that can be done that's considered to be affordable that goes towards our affordability RHNA numbers. So technically, even though it may not be realistic, the higher that affordability is, the better it is for us to be able to meet that number. Is that true?
the higher the qualifying income is, the easier it is to meet it.
Right.
The less subsidy money you need to meet it.
Right. Even though it may not be accurate, at least if we want to meet the numbers. Anybody else? Yes. See, you knew you weren't done.
No, I'm never done. This is off topic also, but it's something that I've brought up a couple of times. And that is, if so many smaller cities in particular are having difficulty meeting the RHNA numbers, and the impact is so great on their environment, their quality of life, what is the answer for small cities banding together and asking for some kind of exemption? Maybe cities 10,000 or less wouldn't be required to the state RHNA standards. And how would we go about such a thing?
I wish I had a nickel for every time I'd heard questions along those lines. I mean, there is so much frustration with the housing element requirements and the state's standards and the RHNA. You know, and I could philosophize at length about how we got to this point and what I think the likelihood, but I don't want to waste your time with that. I think it's, you know, the state legislature has set these rules, and the rules have gotten much tighter in the last 10 years, not looser. And that kind of surprises me. I mean, I thought when so many cities started struggling with this in the last 5 years or so that there would be some backlash in Sacramento. And by and large, I have not seen it. I mean, I've seen individual cities and individual councils and so forth and planning commissions be very upset with it, but I have not seen any kind of unified, effective push in Sacramento for change.
Can I just add to that? You know, with Carl Morehouse being at the top of the pyramid at SCAG and also being on the Housing Advisory Group at the League of California Cities, we have the biggest in we could possibly have. But Paul and Betsy and I met with him several months ago in many ways threw cold water on our ability to make any major change. It's more like very incremental change might be possible if we're lucky.
Then I suggest it's time we start working through our elected representatives in Sacramento, because I agree Carl is not going to make any change for Ojai. We're too small a percentage.
Any other comments, questions?
Well, just for the benefit of the public as well as the council and commission, I wanted to let everyone know that we're saliently putting the housing element update on our website. We're going to have some key slides, some of the key statistical information that the overlay sites, the table that shows the acreage and the provides the information on the overlay sites, because up until this point all we've had is the 23 candidates, but now we actually have 8 adopted, so we're going to put that on our website. And then as we move through the process of drafting the housing element, we're going to make sure that all that is very visible on our city website, so there's as much information out there to the public as can be. I just want to make sure everybody's clear that our very next step is to take this input and put together a draft housing element that will next go to the Planning Commission for a public hearing. And part of that is because of the compressed time frame that, again, we're under because of the deadline of February, early February 2014. And that being the case, I think it might be beneficial to have some of the council members also provide input on that early draft as part of the Planning Commission review, or figure out how there's a way that we can get some of the council's input in addition to the Planning Commission's input at that first public hearing, so that we're not having to totally redirect our efforts at the City Council public hearing. So we'll talk internally and see what the best mechanism there is for that, but I do want to encourage the council to follow along the very next step, and I would probably ask John what he thinks in terms of the time that it'll take to draft the update, because I think our schedule calls for submitting the draft to the state HCD, meaning the council's public, or it's not a public hearing, actually, I take that back, it's a workshop, or it's a decision-making, it's a discussion item, but it's directing staff to submit the housing element. I think we're looking at the second meeting in August for that, which means that the Planning Commission, their recommendation to City Council on the draft housing element has to be at the latest in the early part of August. So is that a feasible time frame, John? And I apologize for putting you on the spot, but I just want to make sure we're all aware of where we are.
Well, my answer is what any good consultant would say, and that's yes, how high?
All right, anything else?
Yes.
Yes.
At our places, we have a handout. It's from Bill Miley, and I just want to make sure that you're aware of it, because the type of questions that Bill asks are the type of questions you get with a great number of people in the community. And I see where there's some confusion in what some of his comments. So I'd like to make sure that you read that and help the community separate out what applies to the fourth cycle, what we can do in the fifth cycle, and what we need to be preparing for in the sixth cycle. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was going to be my last comment, is that everybody has Bill Miley's letter to us in front of you as part of item agenda 1, and I'd like to make this part of the record of this meeting so that Mr. Douglas can have the opportunity of reading it. So if you'd make that that specific written communication part of our record. Anything else? Mr. Douglas, you have anything to add before we conclude?
I thank you for your interest, and I look forward to working with you.
Okay. Thank you. We stand adjourned.